Ladies and gentlemen, tonight's performance will include beautiful beads, jazzy chasubles, and trips to the metaphorical wilderness as we discuss indigenous art of the Nisga'a tradition with Julia and Adam Kozak here on Created Things. Hello, and welcome to Created Things, a podcast of Catholic creatives and the only arts podcast hosted by two sexy little Vienna sausages. I am artist and psychotherapist Jacob Flores Popchek, and with me as ever is my faithful friend, Father Gabriel Toretta. That was an alliteration that was a little harder to say than I would have liked. How you doing, Father?
Faithful friend Fabio Ferretto. Yeah, that's right. I know. The problem is you. Well, what I like about it is that it brings out the silent Fs. You know, did you know there's this thing in that there are these British nobility the reason that you know that they're from very old families is they have these like silent initial Fs.
I did not know this. How would I have known this?
Well, I know it, so why don't you know it? I feel like this is you can't prove me wrong on that, sucker. No, it's a whole thing. I know it ultimately from reading P.G. Wodehouse my entire life, which, you know, kids don't get started on P.G. Wodehouse early because it's it's a hard drug.
It's a gateway drug to being a huge nerd.
I'm afraid it's not really a gateway to anything. It just is. Yeah. It's like heroin isn't really a gateway to anything. It's just like, wow, you just fell in the hole. Wow. You jumped right in, didn't you?
Gateway to itself.
Yes, exactly.
So
anywho,
I made the little Vienna sausages joke only because I wanted to give you an opportunity to answer a question that we haven't answered in some time via a game I like to call
Jacob and Father Gabriel.
Could we call it That in Savone, though? Because I just feel more comfortable about it.
Well, tell us why you would feel more comfortable in that.
Well, I just generally have a preference for things with bad German accents, but which I think we all do somewhere in our hearts. But also in part, this is because technically speaking, I no longer live in Chicago because I am now in Vienna, where the sausages are from. My goodness. Yes. I don't. Yes.
Right. And nothing else.
Yes. Technically,
there's no history there.
No,
don't Google it.
It's amazing. Yeah, no, absolutely don't Google it. You walk around and the streets are empty. There's nothing there. It's just these like burned out factories. It's incredible. Yeah, making Vienna sausages. That's all they do. It's sad, really. I mean, yeah, I don't know what people talk about it, but anyway, there it is. Yeah, no, it's incredible.
So what brings you to Vienna? Because you're going to be there. This is not like a little short trip. You're living there.
Yeah, I live here now. As long as the government gives me residency permit, which they have not, technically speaking, done yet. Don't worry. That does not mean I'm an undocumented worker. It just means that because I don't work, so that makes things easier. But they haven't. We've made an agreement that they will consider giving me permission to live here for a year or two, but they have not yet acted on that, which is how things go. It's fine. So yeah, but I'm going to be here for a year, and the goal is really just to keep working on my German. I'm writing a dissertation right now, and the thing about writing a dissertation is that, like, I mean, you're basically just like a boil on the skin of humanity, and so like you're not really doing anything, and I figured like this is probably the best thing I can do with my life is just like make sure that my German's really good, and do that in Vienna.
Just go hide in a several 100-year-old monastery in the hills so that you're not inconveniencing the rest of society too greatly.
This was my thought. Yeah, exactly. I this is my exact plan. Yeah.
Well, I'm down for it. The only problem, of course, the only way you are actually further inconveniencing humanity, ironically, is that it now is much more difficult to schedule this podcast, the recordings, because we're dealing with very different time zones. And adding to that, complexity, is the fact that the guests, which we're very excited, who we're very excited to be welcoming today, not which, they're not inanimate objects. What are you talking about? Are joining us from beautiful Canada. I want to welcome to the podcast Julia Kozak. She's an Indigenous First Nation artist from the Nisga'a Nation, as well as a powwow dancer and a cultural educator. Along with her is her husband, Adam Kozak. He's a super chill indie musician and a cultural representative working in the faith and evangelization space. Thank you, Kozaks, for joining us. How is it in sunny Canada today?
Sunny with 3 feet of snow.
Ooh, yeah. Well. Hey, listen. I mean, it's the middle of September. Okay, like we have to accept that. Yeah, that's what life is like, you know.
So we got Vienna, we got Canada, we got Florida, we got the full sort of pentaverate here. So Julia, I want to start us off because, as I mentioned in your intro, you're working primarily in Indigenous art forms in the Nisga'a tradition. This is way too broad a question, I know, but this is an art form that the vast majority of our listenership is not going to be very familiar with. Can you give us kind of the elevator pitch for what it is you're doing artistically?
Sure. Well, artistically, I do a lot of traditional West Coast style painting and beadwork, and I design and I create and build regalia, which is the clothing that we wear when we powwow dance and for ceremonies. And so it just involved a lot of design work and hands-on creatively that way.
That's beautiful. Do you
Very cool.
Let me just ask about that. So with the, like, for instance, with the regalia, do you do every step of the process? Are you cutting and sewing fabric? Are you, do you make the whole thing yourself, or do you design and then you work with other artists who then do the cutting and the sewing and putting all the pieces together, or how does that work?
Yeah, I design. I do it from start to finish. I design everything myself. I have a traditional button blanket that I made for my traditional regalia, and that's a Northwest Coast kind of regalia that we use and we wear. And so from start to finish, I designed my own sort of crest. I drew it out. I cut out the pieces. Took the design for the button blanket, and for all the regalia, I sew it together by hand and do all the beadwork.
I'm sorry, you sew everything by hand. You sew everything by hand.
Yes.
Oh my gosh, I have a really good friend who's a seamstress, and sometimes people with sort of Ren Fair enthusiasms will ask her if she'll do some very, very large format item by hand. And she says, I'm like, no, honey, no, you know? So, I mean, that is remarkable. That's remarkable.
As a nerdy little Caucasian theater kid, I can say that if a sentence is preceded by Ren Fair enthusiasm, it's going to be toxic as all.
That's true. That is a pretty different thing, but still, that's incredible. And like, so, you know, I got the chance to see some of the images of some of your regalia, which are really splendid. I'm from Spokane, Washington, so eastern side of Washington State, and so a lot of these, some of these traditions are somewhat familiar to the peoples who live in the area of where I grew up from, but. So like some of the visual look.
Just be honest. You grew up in the town from the Twilight books. You grew up in
Twilight Town.
That's right. Oh,
you are a werewolf.
I am technically a werewolf. I did actually drive by it in the summer, and I was shocked. I was confused as all get out to realize that was where Twilight was supposed to have taken place. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. Although we do mention Twilight a lot because why not? But yeah, so like I'm familiar with the general look, which is this very distinctive and striking appearance. But just for my own sake, because I'm very ignorant of this, what are the materials being used here?
It would be called duffel material, or what we would call Hudson Bay blanket material. This is what the traders would have brought when they first made contact with the Northwest Coast peoples. So the people used to weave things out of the materials that they had there, such as cedar and mountain goat wool and things like that. And so then when the traders brought in the blankets, it gave them a new material that they could work with for this art form. And then the buttons on it would be like mother of pearl shell buttons, which glint in the firelight. So when they're dancing, it looks like the eyes are flashing, and it makes it look like their crest on their blankets are almost alive as they're dancing.
That is amazing. That is super, super cool. Adam, I want to loop you into this conversation as well, of course. And thank you again for joining us. The Father Gabriel's talking about how, he is somewhat familiar with the art form because of where he grew up. I'm somewhat familiar with some of these art forms, very different area culturally, but my wife's background is in New Mexico. My father-in-law, as I've mentioned on this podcast before, is a traditional fancy dancer. That's the term he uses, and participates in Gathering of Nations and stuff like this. So some of these, adjacent traditions are familiar to me. But the way I specifically became aware of you guys is that in the faith space, you guys recently took on a very big and exciting project together. Adam, could you tell us a little bit about the pontifical visit and some of the stuff you guys did there? Because that was super cool.
Okay, so I'm glad you were going to ask me about that project and not my ongoing reenactment project with Legos of the Death Star. So I'm glad we're talking about that. Okay,
we'll do a separate episode.
That's a whole separate thing. You can't combine things that complicated and beautiful. I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's a whole other created thing. Yes. So, my wife and I, for a number of years, I guess, have had a foot in both worlds of indigenous and cultural traditions, and then also being Catholic as well. And so in Canada, there's been a history of mistreatment by members of the church towards indigenous people. And specifically in the area of what are called IRS, which is not like for you Americans, Internal Revenue Service. No, it's actually something called the Indian Residential School System. Okay, and through that, it was revealed that through decades and decades, there was a lot of different abuses in different ways and different levels. In many of these schools happening, and just even the idea of it itself. And so that's a whole issue in and of itself that does require looking into, because it's a very serious part, at least as Canadians, we can speak, in our country's history, and a very big, an absolute pain that we feel to this day, especially for people in Indigenous communities. About at the end of May 2021, there was a revelation of around Kamloops Indian Residential School of an area of unmarked graves, and that showed the bodies of potentially 215 people there that were unmarked. And so it opened up a lot of questions about Indian residential schools in Canada, and specifically the people who ran these schools. About 60% of them in Canada were run by the Catholic Church, and then the Anglican Church, or I think in America you call it the Episcopalian Church, I think. Yeah, the Church of England. I think there was some that was run by Mennonites, some of them what would be known also as the United Church in Canada in later years. So basically the idea was the government of Canada had this idea of residential schools, but who had the infrastructure to be able to do it would be the churches at the time. So it was the government's idea. It was enforced by the RCMP and played out through the churches. And so last year when there was these revelations, it caused the entire country to do a lot of soul searching about what this means, and including also the Catholic Church. And so what happened was that there was a delegation of some indigenous leaders that went to Rome to meet with the Holy Father, Pope Francis, in late March, early April of 2022. And there, the Holy Father listened more to these instances of abuse and neglect. And this is something that's been actually going on in different ways for decades. There's been different apologies made and such, but it's been a path that's had a lot of twists and turns along the way. But what's been remarkable about 2022 in Canada and this issue is then there was the historic apology that Pope Francis gave in early April of 2022 on behalf of for those hurt in the treatment. But then also Pope Francis accepted an offer that was presented to him by many indigenous leaders to come to their lands and visit and be and just to come. And so this was accepted by Pope Francis. And so this brought to the papal visit to Canada, which he calls a pilgrimage of penance, which happened in late July of 2022. So my wife and I, because of our work in one foot in both areas of Indigenous and non-Indigenous, Catholic, and reaching out to non-Catholics, we were asked to kind of come aboard this team as small pieces in trying to put together this huge historic visit, which, I mean, it's highly unusual for a pope to go to a place to apologize, essentially. Mm-hmm. And so it's very historic, very much for healing. And there was quite a bit of controversy along the way as well, insofar as the subject matter, as you can imagine, right? It's not something that's just like you say, I'm sorry, and then it's all good. There's a lot of, deep stuff there. So we were asked to be part of this planning team for the Holy Father, for his stops in different spots around the province of Alberta, Quebec, and the Arctic. And there's a small city called Iqaluit to represent these different Indigenous peoples across the land.
Wow. So, Julia, how did you obviously created some art pieces for this, and how did that end up getting looped into this whole process? And how did you even, I get overwhelmed when I get, an inquiry about a 32-page children's book. How did you even begin to start to rationalize the immensity and intensity in your own feelings and nuances about creating ultimately the artwork that you did for this occasion?
For the vestments for the Pope.
Well, yeah. Tell us about that process. Yeah, because that's, I guess, what I'm queuing up is that you were invited to do some vestments for Pope Francis on this visit, and tell me about how that happened.
Sure. So we were meeting with some people who are part of the team as well for the Office of the Papal Visit to Canada. And they knew that I was an artist and that I had designed regalia for myself to dance in. And they saw some of the images of my regalia and said, would you prayerfully consider working on a design for the vestments for the Commonwealth Stadium Mass in Edmonton that the Pope will be celebrating? And so my first response was, let me pray on it. It's quite a huge undertaking. And I think it's likely it was the first time that he would be wearing a design by an Indigenous woman, designed by an Indigenous woman to celebrate Mass in. And so I wanted to make sure that I could, first of all, it was kind of a short time notice. There was just a few weeks until it happened. So,
are you serious? This is a few weeks warning. Yeah,
it was maybe three weeks. Yeah, 3 weeks.
Oh my gosh! I just assumed, well, I guess the timeline you laid out for us does mean that the whole thing happened pretty quickly. But oh my gosh, Julia, that's hard to countenance.
Yeah. So it was about 3 weeks, maybe just over 3 weeks, to sketch out a design. Make sure that it had certain elements in it that they were looking for, I wanted it to be able to tell a story, to resonate with people when they saw it, and make sure that I was doing it in a very prayerful way. So I wanted to make sure first that I would be able to get it done in time. So this was on top of all of the other planning work that we were doing as well. So it was like two full-time kind of thing. So when I kind of thought, well, I've been asked, and I know I have been given skills to be able to do this. And just as a creator, as a designer, as someone who understands concepts of sewing and detail and things like that, I should do it if I'm asked to. And so I agreed and started working on some sketches and designs. And they were to be submitted first to the Vatican. They needed to be approved. So I had some different ideas, and I wanted to make sure that they were correct and that they would actually work even technically. There were some, I like to try to branch out in my ideas and try some different new things. And so I had an idea for some beadwork for the front of the chasuble, the front and the back of the chasuble that I had never seen before on a vestment. And so I was working out some different ideas and just kind of hoping and praying that it would work out. And so it ultimately, it was approved. It kind of went back and forth a little bit. They said they thought the Pope might look at it and say like, oh, I don't want to wear something like that. And then, but at the end it was approved in entirety. And so then I had to get work on the actual pieces and finding like the fabrics and actually doing the beadwork for it. So
classic Vatican. We'll take 3 weeks to approve it, and can you have it done yesterday?
Yeah.
Exactly. That's amazing.
Oh yeah, it was I think it was an honor. It was a privilege and an honor to be asked to be the one to do that, and I'm very glad that it worked out.
That's amazing. Now I know that we'll be able to put up for the people who are watching a video of this some images of the chasuble. But would you mind? I mean, you might be tired of it at this point, but it is a beautiful work of art, and it has this beautiful and very unexpected context. Would you mind sharing a little bit about what the piece you created is?
Sure. Yeah. So it contains a lot of symbolism, and I kind of started out in my description because we had the image of the sketch that I wanted to show. And then also I wanted to be able to share in writing what each thing meant. So even the colors, the shapes, everything has a different meaning and a symbolism to it. And so starting with the colors, the different colors that kind of represented. So it was a white chasuble because he was celebrating Mass on a feast day. So that was set. There was a red panel in the front and in the back that represents to the Nisga'a people, the color red represents life. So women tend to wear red. We say red over black. So it shows that we are life givers. Men tend to wear black over red to show that because black is like a warrior color, a protector. Okay. So they defend life. So they wear black over red. And there were copper elements in it as well, which to me represented creation and the earth and what God has given to us. So we've got life and creation in there. And also, to me, white represents spirit. So we had the combination of life and earth and like creation and spirit as well that came together. So I did have some elements that I know the Archbishop in particular had asked for. So I wanted to try to incorporate that as much as I could. I also wanted to try to have, from my artistic background and tradition, that kind of art style of the Northwest Coast, indigenous style to come into it. So the shapes and things like that you see are, and the symbolism is very much Northwest Coast, comes from those kind of stories and those lessons that we learn. So I have a circle in the center of a copper circle, which represents Christ as the Eucharist. And then radiating out from that, it's a white cross that I have radiating out from that. And there are 4 crescents that come out from the circle that represent the cross. And so to the northwest coast of the Nisga'a people, there's a symbolism which is called the stone in the ripple. And so it's when you drop the stone into the water and it creates this ripple effect. And so it reminds us that everything that we do and say has meaning and can change things and has an effect on things that and people in our life that, going on that we might not even see how far it spreads out. So we need to be careful to choose things that are right and true and just and kind, rather like build people up rather than, tearing them down or, creating hopelessness. You want to bring hope to people. So make sure you choose what you do is good. And for us, we have Christ at the center. And so he teaches us these things. That's what we want to radiate out. Then there are 4 pieces that are around the outside of the cross, which represent the 4 gospels being taken out into the 4 directions. And within each of those is a copper bead. So it's like we're bringing the word with us out into the world. Then down each side, there's 4 shapes. So one of the requests was that they wanted a symbolism of living water, like a symbol of baptism to be coming from the cross. So I put 4 white pieces that come down the sides, but they could also represent wings, like wings of a dove or wings of an eagle. In many many indigenous traditions, the eagle is the animal that flies the highest and is closest to the creator. And then for the living water, this is what I wanted to try that was so different that I wasn't sure if it even technically was going to work out. Was I wanted to add an element of beadwork rather than and I tried different styles with different fabric kind of drawing, seeing in my mind, how would it work with looking just with fabric put on? And it just didn't sit quite right with me to just use fabric to represent water. So I made 12 strands of turquoise and copper and white beads and freshwater pearls and attached them to a netting. Like I beaded together a thin line of like netted beadwork and hung them down the front or like down the center of the strand, those long strands. And it worked out that I was working with a very talented seamstress. Her name is Susan Hawk in Vancouver. And so she was the one who sewed the pieces on. And so she managed to attach it very nicely and made sure that the tops of them were secured, and it worked out and actually looked very beautiful.
That's incredible.
Big risk, big reward.
Yeah, no kidding. I mean, no kidding. But that is so beautiful. That's extremely beautiful.
I'm really glad it was so well received too. Gosh, I mean, that would have really sucked if you'd kind of put all that effort in. But I do, in my experience, like when an artist really believes in something and can really back up the symbolism with some real passion, generally speaking, people are receptive. I want to come back to that idea, but I also want to ask both of you. I mean, this is something that I struggle with personally as an artist, and then I know there are obviously larger conversations throughout the art world, faith art world, etc., about how different symbolic languages can be combined or not. Right? That, like, on the one hand, this is a perfect example of a time where 2 symbolic languages can come together in a really, really beautiful way. But there are also times where symbolic languages can undermine one another. And I think, like, too often this conversation is probably caught up in sort of stereotypical, liberal conservative type politics where, a stereotypically more progressive person might say, hey, let's swap all of the more traditional symbolic language of Catholicism, for instance, for something more, new age or unfamiliar or exotic from our perception, right? And then, a more stereotypically conservative person would say, oh, no, we have to adhere exclusively to our own symbolic language. And I think that's probably transferable to most anthropological groups, right? Probably most groups can be divided where, like, a certain number of people say, hey, let's stick to the old way, and a certain number of people say, hey, let's change everything and potentially throw the baby out with the bathwater. And you guys are both with this particular art project, but then also in your lives walking that line of trying to bring art forms, symbolic languages, spiritualities together in a way that complements rather than undermines or detracts from either one. And I'm just curious how you guys both in your own personal estimations, spiritualities, artistic journeys have done that, but also, I mean, not to put you on the spot too much, but what advice out of your experience you could offer for other people trying to do that with their cultural backgrounds or their symbolic languages? Because it is a conversation that in some way, shape, or form, I think we all have to have with ourselves.
Yeah, well, maybe I'll address the first part, and if you can address the second part there, dear, if you're okay with that. Insofar as Jacob, you made a really good point about, like, what does it mean when you have distinct cultures meeting, right? Because on one level, it can be a clash, and some people want that, meaning they want to preserve what their culture is. And so this, you can see, and something like this could be very much a faithful Catholic could say, you know what? Why is the Holy Father dipping his toes into this water a little too much? Why are we kind of going in that direction? Maybe you might have an indigenous person as well who might say, why is the Holy Father coming? And, you know, why do you want to be like in our culture now when you've done damage in the past? Right. So there are points to be made. I think it's important to note that what Julia did and proposed was not on behalf of any nation. And it's important to recognize, too, at least in Canada, generally speaking, you look at the First Nations people, the Métis, which is traditionally more of a mix of like French, Canadian, Indigenous people, and the Inuit people. And then within those people, and especially amongst the First Nations people, there's many nations, right? So it's important. I know we're using the term indigenous a lot here, but it's more like if you're going to use the term Europe, it's like, oh, you're Europe. Right. Here's Europe food. Here's Europe clothes. It's like, right, well, what does that mean?
My favorite restaurants are European restaurants. Adam, what are you talking about?
Yeah, well, but what does that mean? I mean, are you having sauerkraut or are you having pasta? You know,
we joke, but sauerkraut pasta is my favorite food.
we joke, but I do legitimately love the European. There's this distinct category of like grocery store. That's the European grocery store, which 100% of the time means Russian. But they very rarely say like Russian grocery store. They always say like European grocery store. Very occasionally they'll be like maybe from a place in the Baltics, but if you say like, well, what is European food? Well, it turns out it's Russian food. Right, so it turns out there's an answer to that question.
Yeah.
No, but it's a point well taken, Adam.
Right. No kidding.
You can't actually paint with too broad a brush with these different cultural groups that from the outside seem homogenous, but from the inside are anything but.
Oh, absolutely. And that's very true within Canada, the lands of Canada. And so sometimes, you might even see that whole people visit of pilgrimage. There might be some Indigenous people say, you know, for the damage done through the church, I don't want any part of this. And that's legitimate. I mean, you can't argue somebody's experience. There's some people who are saying, you know what? I want to see where these attempts of reconciliation go. And some people also might say, I want to reconcile now. And all these responses are all equally legitimate and real and serious. And so even how that was expressed in the art, like there was no artwork that Julia produced that's like, here, I'm giving you regalia, like something that's inappropriate for the Holy Father to have.
Right.
Or this represents your us. Like Julia was not part of that. She's one woman who happens to be Indigenous, who happens to belong to a certain nation, but she's not even doing that on her nation, because within her own nation, there'll be divided opinions, right? Just like, it's like, I'm doing this on behalf of Europe or Africa. It's like, well, it's more complicated than that. So I think it's important for us to acknowledge Indigenous people around the world, whether they be in Canada, America, throughout the world, that they're just not a monolith. So hopefully what Julia's presentation of what that is and how the Holy Father received it is understanding the value and the uniqueness of individuals nestled within their own cultures. The other thing here is there's a choice. We can live in our societies absolutely distinct and absolutely segregated. And however you want to splice that, whether it be by race, ethnicity, culture, however you want to splice that. But it seems like in the history of the church, with the ups and downs, with the good evangelization and the places where they've fallen absolutely on their face and lost the plot, the good stuff is where Christ says, this good news is not just restricted to us and our little group. And and like, you guys talk a lot about art on the podcast. If you see a good movie or you see a good show, it's like you want to share it. And that's the Christian perspective. And unfortunately, some people will take that as like forcing upon, right? And so the idea with the art, though, here is the art it's representative of ideas, but it's not specifically representative of everybody signing on. It means it's not propaganda, because propaganda just tells you something and you have to believe it. With art, with art, there's a conversation to be had. You can look at these pieces that Julia does, whether it's this piece or other artwork. There's a conversation to be had. And so hopefully, there's going to be people who are just going to be very traditionalist minded. And I love tradition. We are people of tradition. But there's also people in tradition who understand for our tradition to survive, it's good to sometimes show it to the world.
Well, yeah, and that's exactly what I want to hear you elaborate on a little bit, Julia, because like in my mind, there is a way for cultural traditions to be like, chocolate and peanut butter, where they are very distinct, but they are deeply complementary, and I bring them together that way. But so often people make that mix poorly, where one replaces the other. Just to use the Catholic example, right? I see all the time people will start throwing away certain Catholic words because they want to use, quote unquote, newer words, or, in other traditions, they'll throw away certain symbols because, these other symbols are so much, cooler or different. And then, other people will be these stark adherents. And like, how do you personally as an artist find that line in the symbolic languages that are meaningful to you between complementarity and like canceling each other out on some level, or one winning over the other?
So I guess the question, one of the questions might be like, how do you bring together two deep traditions, like two traditions that go so far back, and value them for what they are and see them for that value that they have, rather than trying to change it for something new? And it doesn't say that things don't evolve and change and can't become better and grow into something new, like a transformation. But I think if it goes down to the root of things, looking at what are the values that people hold that we know are good, like just inherently good, and that are right. So something that I have found for bringing together, like, let's say like Catholic tradition and Indigenous, like from my own experience, traditions, in artwork or in my regalia or in my dancing or in any of these other practices is, am I doing it in a way that shows love? Do I show respect and honor to people? Do I treat others with human dignity? Am I showing fortitude and courage in standing up for what's right? Am I speaking what's true? Am I being honest with people? And those are traditions that, we hold as Catholics as well, as Christians. And we've been taught that these are fruits. these are gifts of the spirit, and so it kind of goes down to how deep do those traditions go back in just human nature, that these stories and traditions come from thousands and thousands and thousands of years back, that have been sent through generations and have been quite a legacy. So when you look at it from that kind of lens, it's not so different. And so then I find that I can express that in my artwork. And that's one of those things that came across in the chasuble. Like Adam said, it's not that I'm doing it on behalf of a certain people. I'm just this artist who was asked to do this. And this is coming from my experience of what I want to share with people, the hope that I have found, and how can I create this thing that expresses that love and that respect and that honor, and not shying away from the truth of things, being honest about it, and being wise in what we share. But I wanted to kind of make sure that those sorts of things get incorporated into it and into the artwork that I create. And when people look at it, maybe it'll resonate with them.
Hearing that answer, which is so rich, I love, because it gives me an insight into not just the art itself, but like why the art is such a success, why it's so beautiful as a work of visual design, why it's so beautiful as a work of textual design, and then why specifically, and here's the kind of kicker, that it works powerfully as a liturgical vestment, actually used in the liturgy, because what you've just described is like, I mean, this is how art works. What you described, if I could just put it crassly, is like being a serious artist making a genuine work of art. Like Adam, you raised the specter of like propaganda, and like we circle back around on that a lot, because it's just something, it will be impossible to create something good if it comes out of like I need this to represent these people, and it will look like this, and we have these things, and I have to work in this, and then I'm going to get in that, and
I want you to know this,
and I want you to get this
done.
out of it, and like at the end of it, like, children, we will have learned the following 27 items, that a committee put together. That doesn't create anything. It just creates visual noise, but there is this powerful thing, like how does good art get made? It gets made by going into these like deep down rich things about like not just the human experience in general, but like mine, like going deep down into like what I have seen about maybe something general, maybe about something about the whole world experiences, but so deep down and rich by the way that I've seen it. Like there's a certain similarity I see with real works of art, with the artistic endeavor, with what a priest does in preaching, because like preaching is also always a failure if it's like, I have these things and I'm going to tell you about them, and like at the end of the day, like you will have learned the following 18 items of doctrine or whatever, not because doctrine is bad, but because that's just being told things. And that's not preaching. Like preaching, from my perspective, is this that the one who is tasked with preaching has to want to meet Christ, has to endeavor to receive that encounter in the context of whatever the thing that we're preaching about. So, the gospel usually, or this liturgical event, or sometimes, an event with people in various modes or whatever. And I have to say what I've seen, but the only way it can be honest is if I say what I have seen, which means I have to actually want to see something, and I have to work hard enough to be free enough and open enough and honest enough. And like you said, like, I was just like deep resonance when you said like courageous enough. Do I have the courage to see it and to be willing to like do what it takes to not shy away from the honesty to actually present it? So I just think like this isn't like a secret for like what's what's Julia Kozak's like top 10 tips for like how to make sweet papal vestments. It's just like, this is how art works, you know, like this is the freedom of the heart that gives a person the ability to like see and show what he or she has seen.
I want to throw in really quickly, just because we're about halfway through and it's important that we give a shout out to some of the artists who help make this podcast a reality. Viewers like you. If you are interested in supporting this podcast, we'd really encourage you to check out catholiccreatives.org/support. It's a Patreon that you can support that will not only help fund this podcast, but also a lot of the really amazing initiatives that Catholic Creatives, which is this really huge international organization of artists of the faith background, do. They have summits, and they have local chapter meetings and different enrichment components. So if you want to be involved in that, we encourage you to sign up for that Patreon at catholiccreatives.org/support. As I said, you can also join our private Facebook group to become a part of that community, with individual subgroups for different art forms, so that you can get to know people and network with people in your specific field and help cut your teeth a little bit better. Additionally, if you go to catholic.store, a lot of the artists with whom we speak and who support us sell some of their goods through there, and it's a really great way to support small artists on a kind of local person-to-person level. So we encourage you to check out both of those groups today. I want to piggyback on what Father Gabriel was saying there, though, because like on the one hand, you're right, Father, like that is what art is, but that's also kind of like the hardest part of art, right? We joke a lot about how shitty Christian movies are by and large, because like they're starting out with this propaganda thing of like, I'm not starting off with my own experience. I'm starting off with what I want other people to know. And it's easy to say that that's a bad idea until you actually sit down in front of a canvas or a piece of fabric or, you know, the paper you're writing your sermon on. And then you become like so passionate about the thing that you want people to know that it's hard to put that aside and just talk about your own experience. And you, Julia, working in these different art forms, and we haven't even touched on the dance thing yet, which I really want to, but then, of course, you, Adam, as a musician, you, Father Gabriel, working in your art forms. I'd love all of our thoughts on this. Like, how do you personally, how do each of us put that aside, put that agenda aside to lean into, as Pope St. John Paul II says, our own unique unrepeatability, and like just create based on our own experience and our own subjective encounter with creation? What's our metric for doing that and not getting too caught up in agenda and propaganda and all that bullshit? Who wants to take it first? Group therapy style. Who wants to take it first?
Sure. Well, if I can just touch on one thing too, like Father Gabriel, what you were saying there, something kind of resonated with me a bit. Like what was interesting, what you were saying about talking from your own experience, and like you have to want these things, and not just a list of something for people to learn. When speaking to people about the design for the vestments, some of the questions that came up is like, well, like, what are you wanting it to say? And what does it say? What do you want people to know from this? What do you want people to understand? And so I think I spoke to kind of like what I mentioned briefly, like just sharing from like my experience, like I've found this hope, and I want people to see that like these choices that we make have an impact on people's lives. So we have to choose what's good and what's right and what's just. And hopefully that brings that to other people, and they can see that, and then maybe they'll feel like they can carry that with them. But I think at one point I was thinking about it, and I just thought, it's still speaking to me. Like, I don't even know, there's part of me that's like, I myself don't know the full entirety of what this means. And so the more that I look at it, the more things stand out, and the more reflections come to my mind about what is like, if I'm the Holy Spirit inspired, what does it mean? What's coming from this? And so it's continuing to tell me this story about this unraveling of what I've experienced in my life. And if that speaks to someone in some way, then that's up to them. But I don't have a full explanation. So it was just funny being asked, like, what do you want this to say to people? What do you want people to know about this? And it's everyone who sees it has their own impression about it. And I think that's why, kind of tying into this, like why Jesus spoke in parables. And like Adam had said too, people like you can't argue with someone's experience. And Jesus telling parables that resonated with people who he was speaking to, and they were like, okay, I understand now what you're talking about. I kind of understand this. And that kind of goes into setting aside like the propaganda, or like, what is the message that you want to share, and just create art. Is, I think for me, when I'm looking at paintings, or if I'm creating something and I want it to just be a story. So if someone looks at it, it continues to bring something up in them. And so for me, it's like taking maybe inspiration from the mythology or storytelling from the nation that I come from, or from different nations. They didn't have a list of things. If they said you're not allowed to fish here, you're not allowed to fish too much, or you're not allowed to hunt this animal, you're not allowed to. And if they just had a whole list of rules, it would be very hard for people to understand and remember. So they would tell things through story instead, and then you remember, and then you pass these stories down, because everyone enjoys hearing a good story and has time for that. So yeah, just having a story aspect to art is how I can kind of set aside, like, what do I want it to say to people? It's like, how does it speak to me first? And then if that affects other people, then, that's on them. So.
Yeah, I love that, because like there's basically, sort of the first art form that's like sort of a native language for me is just literature, like novels in particular. It's just always been like a very deep, rich part of my life. And so like there's this particular question, this like kind of question that like high school English teachers everywhere, and unfortunately like a lot of college English teachers everywhere will ask. That says like, this is how you make sure that you kill any nascent interest in real literature in any human being, is you ask them questions like, and this is always my example, is like, what does the white whale in Moby Dick mean? It's like, and goodbye. I just held up your little beautiful nascent love of literature and I shot it in the head. Because there is just anyone who believes that there's an answer to this question will just never get what literature is and what it does and how it works and its place in the human heart. And
I really liked that actually about your answer to one of our earlier questions, Julia, when you were talking about some of the symbols you were using in the actual vestment, right? Like there are some symbols both from the Christian tradition and from the Nisga'a tradition that are set in stone, like red means this, and water means that, and this dove means this other thing, right? But then there's some things where you were very clearly saying, but copper meant to me this. And I think like educating yourself as an artist is a really important part of this. Like there are some things that just mean things, but then there's some things like the white whale and Moby Dick that like we can project a lot onto, and we're supposed to, and we can have fun with that. And knowing the difference and being able to respect the pros and cons of both, I think is an important part of this process too.
Yeah. And I think there's something with that too. Like, I think we can also do ourselves a disservice by overreading how certain we are about like what things mean, like what things assume that things are very familiar when they aren't necessarily. So for instance, what I was thinking about, what does a chasuble mean? Like, how do we think about these things? And like, okay, it's an essential part.
Actually, Father Gabriel, we should, speaking of other cultures, I just blanked out. I just realized, for those who have no Catholic background, can you just briefly define what a chasuble is for our listeners?
Yeah, bro. It's the kind that mostly gets worn today. Sort of looks like a poncho, to be totally honest. And it's a ritual garment that priests wear when they're saying mass. So it has exactly one purpose and exactly one place of use. And it's just when it's only worn by the priest, and it's only worn by the priest when he's celebrating the Mass, the heart and nature of which is consecrating the Eucharist, which we believe is the real body and blood of Jesus Christ. And so it's from that central reality that here's this moment where heaven meets earth in this super literal way that sort of changes everything, and it changes things like, wow, now suddenly this doesn't take place like randomly on like a beach. It takes place in the, like, it generates a space around itself that we call a church, and it's going to have certain contours even within a lot of variety, and like it sort of throws up this net of transformation around it because of how dramatic the event is, and literally everything around it has to be different than anything else in the world, and so you don't just wear any kind of garment that you would ever wear under any other circumstances. It has exactly one purpose in one circumstance, and it's just that. So it's a dramatic kind of thing, and it's a big part of our faith that that priests have been celebrating the liturgy in one form or another from the very beginning, from the resurrection of Christ forward. And certainly some things have changed, but that this dramatic reality has stayed the same. So this garment, this ritual garment that we call the chasuble, it becomes a part of the liturgy in about the early 4th century. Okay, so it's around from about the 4th century. It's complicated. It comes from imperial vesture, actually. But the very first person, so it starts to be used. The garment had been around before. It had been a part of you could call pagan Roman imperial vesture. Okay, so there's that, and then it becomes the part of the sacred ritual vestment that only the priest wears, which, so I thought was already an interesting transformation. But the very first person, you think, well, this is really important. Like, people are going to be talking about it, thinking about it, saying, what does it mean? What does it mean to me? Like, what like, surely the church, because they're so fixed on things like this means this and that means that, surely people like jumped right on that, saying like, this has to mean this, and you have to say it means this. And, when you're writing about the chasuble, I want you to make sure that you says it means this. The first person to write about it, actually, is one of my guys, actually, who wrote a book in 819. So like 500 years later, he like sat down and he said, like, well, I think it means this. It's going to be like that. It's like these kinds of things. And it's like, okay. And I just think that's really beautiful. And like, and it's funny because like the things he says like, well, here, I'm going to read you this little passage from this book in 819 called On the Formation of Clerics. And he says, like, speaking about the chasuble, he says, and thus we can understand this garment to mean charity, which goes on top of every virtue. And it covers that with its own beauty, and it protects it and it illuminates it. And he says, just like, there would be no splendor of any beauty if it weren't covered in the radiance of charity. So it is with this, So, okay, so this is like powerful idea. And you think like,
you just had that book lying around?
I was going to say
you
that.
Just had that?
Yeah. Hello. What do you think?
You absolute nerd. I asked you to give a brief Dora the Explorer translation of Vamonos means let's go, but with chasubles, and you just had this ancient mystical text sitting next to you.
I did, yes.
Screw you, dude.
Yeah.
You're too smart.
Yeah. Also, Vamonos does mean let's go. This is by the way what it means to be a doctoral student. It means that you are full of helpful hints like this. But
right, yeah.
Real helpful hints. But one thing I love about this is you say like, wait, is that true? Is that really what that means? Is that really? It's like, well, think, I mean, it is a very beautiful and fruitful answer to like, why does the priest wear a chasuble? Why does he wear this like ritual garment? Why does it have this contour? It's relevant. It's the last thing you put on. So like a poncho, it's going to be it's the thing that shows last, it's the thing that shows. So he's saying it's like charity, which goes on top of all the other virtues. Right. So this is his idea. But the reason I love this is because and why I think it's part of this reflection that we've been talking about, like with art and its creation, is listen, this emerges from the liturgy. It emerges from like 500 years of people praying at the Mass, and thinking about the internal logic of the Mass and what happens when you're praying, and what looks like it's bread and wine becomes the body and blood of Jesus Christ, what it's like for me to be at Mass and to offer my heart to God and to have it be received as part of that sacrifice. Like generations and generations and generations of people like thinking and praying about that. Like it's part of this reality you were saying, Julie, about like you receive these things sort of like handed down, like an ancient wooden banister that's just been smoothed and smoothed and smoothed and smoothed by so many different hands going down it. And then like there's this guy, Rabanus Marius in 819, who asks himself like, what does a chasuble mean anyway? And he's like, well, it's like this.
What does it mean, man?
And like, is that the only answer? No. Is it like super obviously fixed, like the symbolism of a chasuble? No. Is that a powerful and fruitful answer that comes from his own like reflection on the nature of the liturgy and the life of a priest? Yeah, it's cool. And so like as a theoretical artistic project, like it really works. And I just think that there is this continuity, like, anyway.
I just want to really quickly just jump in with the idea of art and the artist. And for example, we were talking about Julia and some of her pieces of artwork, whether it was for the Holy Father's vestments or some paintings or whatnot. It's like your artwork, even though you have like an ethnicity and you're nestled in a tradition, right? What's more maybe accurate is like, I don't know what like rock and roll music is necessarily, but you can kind of say that's Chuck Berry, right?
Yeah,
it's not like all of rock and roll, but that's Chuck Berry. It's like, I don't know what all of literature is, but that's Tolstoy. Right. And I think in a similar way too, and what's helpful too, especially in the big umbrella term of indigenous art, it's like, what does that mean? And like we talked about earlier in this podcast about like so many different nations and traditions, but within their own families, you have individuals, and there's something about that individual. There's a reluctant responsibility that you have to go into the wilderness, and you're going to kind of take some grief from that, right? Like there'll be people, why are you going into the wilderness? What do you think? You think you're better than us? What are you doing? You're going in there and you go and you do something, but then you come back with some sort of riches that we didn't have before here. And then sometimes what we do in our societies is we celebrate artists or whatever. But sometimes we just kind of, I don't know how important that is. And so there's a weird role of what art is as well. And so I think we find this in non-indigenous communities and indigenous communities. So one other thing I would just say, just really quickly, is for people listening, is there's a great value, and in what we call indigenous arts, right? In whether you're in Canada or in America, Native American arts, go and check out these arts created or going through these individuals. It doesn't represent necessarily their tribe, their nation, whatever. But does Tolstoy represent Russia, right? Does Chuck Berry represent all of what rock and roll is, right? So it's in that kind of vein. So I would just encourage to, put some faith in these ones who are willing to go into the wilderness and bring back something to our village, right?
I love that. on that note, Julia, I would love to kind of hear more about your actual artistic journey and background uniquely, of you. I mean, how did you get into the beadwork and some of the fabrication you're doing there? How did you get into powwow dancing? Talk about that unique journey with you as this individual artist, like your husband's saying.
Yeah, I've always been, I guess, a creative type. I've always been into drawing and painting. But I found I do really like working as well with material things, like whether it's fabrics or beadwork or things like that, and taking inspiration from nature, being outside, outdoors, and admiring just what you see, being present in the time and where you are. And often when we go for hikes, I'll point at the little birds that we see, or we'll be having a serious discussion, and I'll be like, "Oh, look at that bird!" Just admiring things when we see them and enjoying that in the moment. And so I've enjoyed like very tactile arts as well, and incorporating different natural kind of things into my art. And so I think that's maybe sort of how I got into beadwork. I've always been hands-on with creating and crafting things. And just as I got more into it, it takes more practice and learning from other people, especially with the beadwork, and because there's different techniques to use to help things stick better and make sure things don't fall apart. And I will just say, like, be careful if you get into beadwork. It's very addictive. I can't really go into a craft store now without staring longingly at the bead section and imagining what I want and what would I get if I had all the money to go and get things.
Okay, I did have to ask that. I'm sorry, just to ask a kind of rough economic questions, but just like, I know that when people get really into like knitting and stuff, and then suddenly like they're either like spending their entire paycheck on these like boutique yarns from the Himalayas, or they're like staring longingly at the like high end things in Michael's, and then like getting the like $2 thing of yarn that like everybody can actually afford. Like, are these? I mean, like obviously the particular materials that you're talking about working with for the papal vestment are more luxury materials, as sort of befits the purpose and the situation and the dignity and the honor of what's happening, and it's liturgical placement, all this kind of stuff. But like ordinarily, I mean, you were talking about sewing a whole body sized regalia with mother of pearl buttons. I mean, these are not small items,
No. Yeah. One thing that's been really neat in my creative journey with this, and even with the papal vestments, is some of those pearls and the shells that I use in my regalia are things that have been passed down to me from my mother, my grandmother,
oh, wow.
Adam's mom, Adam's grandmother, some things, I think even your great grandmother. And so they've been passed down to me. And I made sure, especially with Adam's mom and with my mom and my grandmother and stuff, I said, I don't think I would wear these things or these pieces and use them the way that they are. May I use them for something else? And so they're all like, sure, yeah, go for it.
Oh, beautiful.
Yeah. So those, in particular, the freshwater pearls for the vestments were passed down to me. They were handed down to me from mothers and grandmothers. And same thing with a lot of my regalia, which adds so much meaning to it. I'm carrying my ancestors. I'm carrying our ancestors with me as I dance, and I know that they're holding me up as I'm dancing and praying. And so, even though it's not buying the top end sorts of things, it has so much more meaning for me, and it keeps me mindful of what I'm working on at that time. One of the traditions as we're beading is in many indigenous cultures. I can't speak for all of them, but what I've been taught and what I've learned is each time that you sew on a stitch, each time you sew on a bead, a button, anything that you're putting on, each stitch should be done with a prayer of blessing for the people who are going to be, in particular for regalia, for people who are going to be seeing it. You want them to you want to have these good thoughts in your mind, of prayers of blessing in your mind, so that when people see it, they feel that as well when you're dancing. And so yeah, but yeah, for the beads, there's a lot of things where over the years I see what stands out to me. I have images in my mind of things that I want to create maybe in future, and I just kind of go and look for those things. And sometimes it's even things in nature that I can incorporate. If we're going for a hike or something, if I see some feathers or a neat stone or something, I could use that. I can put that in, and then it reminds me of the times that, our days that we go through just every day. And I remember these times and incorporate them in.
And then when you're actually designing for a specific powwow event, like, are you exclusively designing regalia that you yourself are going to wear? Are you designing regalia for other people? Like, what in your tradition or in your own expression of that, what does that look like?
Yeah, I design my own and wear my own. That's in particular my primary creation when I'm going out for powwows. And I have different pieces of regalia. I have a fancy shawl that I sewed together again by hand, and also my button blanket. So I'll kind of change at the powwow depending on kind of the music or what I feel like dancing to. And so yeah, I have been asked if I will do some designs for other people. Generally, like mothers will ask me if I'll design something for their daughters. So what I would like to do, and what I'd like to do with them, is I talk to them first, converse with them and ask them what their feeling is behind it. Like, what do they feel? What's appropriate? That kind of thing. What kind of, again, colors are huge symbolism, have huge symbolism. What kind of colors would they be looking for, and why? And materials and things like that. Like, why? It comes down to the why of things. Why do you want this? What does it mean to you and your family? Yeah.
That's really beautiful. I mean, it's everything you're talking about, right, Adam? Like, being able to understand first your own individuality and then honor someone else's individuality with, again, I mean, I use the term from JP2's writing, Pope John Paul II's writing, unique unrepeatability, like being able to honor the unique unrepeatability of yourself and other people and what you're doing. And I think that's really beautiful. I mean, it's something we talk about all the time here, and I know I'm biased as coming from like the psychotherapeutic background, but like, I always argue here that there is an intimacy between artist and viewer of the art, and that like you get into trouble when you try to mess with that. We talked a lot about that in some of our kitsch episodes and things, like when things are pretending to be sort of made by an artist, but actually they're mass produced. The home goods, the home goods paintings and all that kind of stuff. We did a whole episode on breaking those down and why I think they're awful. But you guys are really representing beautifully, I think, what that looks like in practice to honor both those people in that intimate way through the creation of art.
Well, one thing too, you just touched upon there, and I'll just link in what you're saying there, Julia. The matter of regalia, like, that's a very intimate thing, and it's really not even discussed publicly. It's very intimate, which is a different thing than when you do paintings. You can paint, and you can, if somebody wants to buy a painting and such, they can do that. And that's a different level. But then, Jacob, like you had mentioned there about the popularity of these kind of like faux paintings that they actually can mechanically reproduce, even with like the texture of like as if it was an acrylic.
We did a whole breakdown. I knew nothing about it. Episode on home goods art. Yeah, check out the home goods art episode. Shameless plug. We did a serial NPR breakdown of what's happening there. Shit is wild. Go ahead.
I'm very proud of that episode because that stuff is much crazier than I thought it was. Significantly crazier. Yeah.
Right. But the thing is, though, too, what do you want in your home? Like, here's the thing. Do you want to bring, it's like, I want to bring in a nice puppy dog that's cute. I know it's all right. But the thing is, though, if you put in your home one of these paintings we see behind us. And for just the people listening, what I'm referring to is an original piece of art that, for example, my wife or any painter makes. You're not bringing home a tamed thing. You're bringing home a wild thing. That's coming out of the wilderness into your home. Do you know how to do that? Because first of all, number one, like a nightmare to a lot of people is you get a piece of art that you think you like, maybe you spent some money on it, you put it on the wall, you have some people over for dinner, and people are like, oh, that's weird, whatever, because that is a shot at you.
Yeah, exactly.
And they're like, oh my, I brought this thing into my home. And now people even think I'm stupid for letting this in. I'm a fool, right? But the thing is, though, with art, though, is like, yeah, well, do we do it for sentimentality? Well, maybe somewhat. Some comfort, yeah, but there's always a challenge in it. Always. Like, I mean, from the investments that you put in the Pope, there's also things that show the pain of the Indian residential schools in that. Maybe not explicitly, but it's there. Even the fact that you had to do this, it shows that, right? So any art, like, you know, if it's like 100% of the time patting you on the head and rubbing your belly, well, you're not dealing with art.
Yeah, that's great.
That's
yeah,
very well said.
Totally.
That's very, very well said. Okay, so we're coming on that time that I know that we should start trying to land the plane. Otherwise, we're entering into kind of Joe Rogan length territory here, which we don't want to do, right? Nobody wants that. But there are two questions that I have that I try to ask any artist I meet. And I won't forgive myself if I don't allow us to touch on these questions. So the first question is just, what is sort of normally I would ask, like, what's the weirdest request you ever gotten as an artist? But as you guys are saying, you know, you don't really do commission so much, but like, what is the weirdest experience you've had working in the field of the beadwork and the powwow dancing and just something that like you'd only experience doing this kind of art form, just the weirdest thing that's happened there. And then the other big question that I always want to ask is, what's the big dream project next, right? I mean, you just checked off making a chasuble for the Pope, right? So that's a bucket list item for a lot of people, but that doesn't mean you're going to, you know, hang up your beadwork tools and go retire now. Like there's a dream project you want to do, and I want to hear about what that looks like. So can you give a stab at either of those questions or both of them? Cause those would just really make me happy if I could hear.
Sure. I'm not sure if it's weird. I don't know if there's too much of a weird thing, but maybe I can share one experience that kind of, it's a learning experience that teaches me and can teach other beaders to secure your threads properly before you start dancing.
God, no.
Yeah. So I was dancing at a powwow one time, and it was an indoor one, and it was just hard, like just like painted over cement floor. It was in a ice rink that didn't have like the ice in it.
Oh, sure.
And so I had just finished tying off my moccasins, and I beaded my moccasins, and they were beautiful, and they had all these beads, and a lot of the beads were actually round. So, like spherical beads. And I was dancing, and I didn't notice anything at first. But then when the music stopped and I kind of went off, and I said hi, you know, to Adam, and I think I got some water, and this older gentleman came over, and he was like, "Come here." And so I was like, "Okay, what is this?" So I went over to him, and he pointed to the floor, and there was round beads like just scattered on the floor. And now if it were on grass, it wouldn't have mattered because they would have just got into the grass. But because it was a hard surface, right, anyone could have stepped on them. And it was interesting though, because traditionally you don't touch someone else's regalia. Oh, so at first I thought maybe he was just like chastising me for, you know, like these beads fell everywhere. But he was actually doing it like in a proper way, where it's like he knows that maybe he shouldn't be touching these pieces that meant something to me. So Adam and I went and we handpicked up all of the beads we could find.
Would you mind just explain that's I mean, it's a hilarious story, but I'm glad we're touching on it because I never would have known that. Can you explain a little bit why that is the case, that you're not allowed to, or you're discouraged, not allowed, but discouraged from touching other folks' regalia that way?
Yeah, it comes down to the fact that you don't necessarily know what other people's intentions are or what they're feeling inside. They could have been doing something terrible or be struggling with something that they need help with, or they have some kind of whatever it is, like just examples, maybe like grudges or anger or fears about things, that when you're trying to wear your regalia and you're dancing, you're trying to bring hope and peace and joy and blessing to people. So if they come and they touch it, it's such a sacred thing. This is why Adam was saying, like, it's so personal, that it's like if you touch it, it's like you might, like, so if someone doesn't know what your intentions are, they don't want you don't want that kind of on there, which sounds a bit superstitious maybe, but
no, I think it's a fundamental aspect or component of the identity of the art form, right? I mean, part of discussing this kind of intimacy and individuality that we're talking about is like, how do I honor it? How do I, I mean, not to use terms like sort of too identifiable with these zeitgeist, but like, how do I respect matters of consent and things like this, right? Where I'm actually honoring the independence of this thing. So no, I super appreciate that.
Yeah,
thank you.
Yeah. And yeah, so maybe I shouldn't phrase it as you're not allowed to. It's considered disrespectful to touch someone else's regalia without their permission. But if you ask them and you're like, oh, may I see that? May I touch that? Or may I give you a hug or something? And if they're like, oh yeah, sure, that's fine, then they're open to you and receive hopefully you're open to receiving the blessing that they have for you when you see the regalia. So.
That's awesome. That's awesome. And then big dream project. What's next? What's the white whale that definitely symbolizes something specific?
Yeah, and what does that white whale mean?
Yeah.
Well, we're working on a lot of different things right now. I don't know. I think I don't have one. I don't have one big project.
Well, maybe just like in a way, because I certainly can't speak for you, dear, even though we are married. But
we talk sometimes because we're married.
We talk a lot, actually.
It's one of the collateral damages of marriage is you end up having to actually talk to each other.
Yeah, but it's good. Like, I mean, because marriage does provide comfort, but it also provides a healthy discomfort too, kind of like art, right? And so
Adam's good because he encourages me in all things creative. So he's the force that kind of pushes me to do more and be better.
Well, we encourage each other.
That's lovely.
Yeah, but so as far as like next and stuff, like a lot of these things, I think with both of our experiences, you try to do things to place yourself where you can approach something, but you don't know what it is. There's still a veil in front of it.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Right. And so like, I don't think like 5 months ago, you would ever thought you were designing vestments for the Holy Father on this, this, or there's a lot of other things. I mean, Julia's very, very, very modest. And like she there's a lot of stuff out there. I know she doesn't have much of a social media presence, but it's all by her choice. And I think part of it too that we choose is like we know that for a lot of people, like being very present on social media means you're real and you exist. But I think part of to try to tap into what art is, there needs to be a healthy detachment at times. And so like for us, discernment, I think, is so huge. There's also been, you mentioned Jacob, there has been some commissions along the way, like that Julia's done in painting, like not in regalia as much, but like painting. And, some people who are well known, I can give you their names, but I'm not going to just, but the thing is though.
Heck, damn it.
Yeah.
I wanted to hear names.
Oh, well, I don't think it's appropriate because the thing is though, it's just, there's been points where when we're looking at things like, how does this make sense in the long term? How does this make sense in the long term? And so it doesn't necessarily make us the most profitable art of approaching art or whatever, or, maybe you'd like to be more prolific or whatever it is. But the way I see it is just, I'm in awe of what my wife does. And what she does is, in a way, it's not solitary, because she taps into her ethnic background. And we're also inspired across different Indigenous nations. The powwow scene really inspires Julia a lot. Like, Indigenous people across Canada, like we continually have to shout out everyone, even people not getting the shine or whatever. It's like, it's about them. And so then you get to a point where it's like, okay, you're in the wilderness, and then sometimes a veil comes down and you see something. And so I don't know. I know that's just a very poetic way of putting it, but Julia, do you have any specifics? I don't know.
Yeah, maybe not necessarily like tied into art, but not necessarily art wise. There are some really unique opportunities to be able to share in schools in particular about Northwest Coast traditional art and storytelling. So I do some storytelling, and which involves basically acting out like the parts. And
so cool. Oh, that's so cool.
And and sharing with them, kind of like we've been sharing with you about the symbolism and the richness of the symbolism, and what does that mean, and what does that teach us? So like younger generation in particular, like kids, like what can we learn from like these symbols and these stories, and how does that teach us to treat others with kindness and just be kind to people and just show love and respect other people and show dignity to them. So yeah, I think being able to share more about that now and just get out there and I don't know, share learning like that.
Invite more people into the family. I mean, it's beautiful, and I'm so glad you guys are doing it. I mean, I know you just referenced, Adam, that you guys aren't super on social media, but is there a way for our listeners to check out some more of your guys' stuff, or to follow what you guys are doing going forward, or even resources maybe that you guys would recommend just to learn more about those traditions that you're describing, Julia, the Northwest traditions that you're talking about there? I know a lot of people listening will want to get their hands and eyes on some of that stuff.
Well, maybe your Instagram. No, yeah, maybe Julia, your Instagram, and maybe it can be kind of put in a description. We'll just share for the viewers or listeners.
Sure. Yeah. So my Instagram is jkozak.nisga'a.art, and Nisga'a
cool.
without the apostrophe.
Yeah.
Right. Apostrophes are hard in Instagram handles. We will link that for sure.
And a huge thing too, because like, even though we talked about art being channeled through the individual, whether it's like a writer, a painter, a poet, but it's always nestled in some sort of a basket though. Right. And that's maybe what we call a culture. And so like, I would encourage generally, and Julia, you can think of maybe others or specifics, but generally speaking, across Canada, there's a wide spectrum of artists who are at their core, they're individuals, but they're nestled within cultures, within nations. And I know that we're having an emphasis about speaking with the Catholic Church, and there are some who are saying, you know what, I don't want anything to do with the church. Their voices still are important to hear and listen to. They give amazing.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And for our American friends as well in the States, different Native American groups, nations, tribes throughout America. Do you have any other specifics that you would recommend right off the top as far as books or?
Not off the top of my head. Okay. There's a lot.
There's a lot out there. So
that's okay. Father, if there's a book out there, Father Gabriel will probably find it. It'll be sitting next to him on the desk.
Yeah, that's what we learned today.
Oh, don't mind me.
Yeah.
Yeah. But start local though. I recommend those, like, for people, grow where you're planted, right? And so if you want to kind of, like, if you're in the Americas, if you're in like Australia, New Zealand, through different parts of Africa, even Asia, and even in Europe too. There's value,
which, as we've established, is one thing. Europe is just one thing.
Yeah.
Oh, that's right.
And they make really great borscht. It's awesome. Yeah. Europe. That's just what Europe does.
Yeah. So grow where you're planted. Check out stuff locally, and go from there.
Beautiful, beautiful parting words. I really appreciate it. Well, Julia, Adam, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. I know we've all benefited from hearing from your guys' experience and your insights. And for those of you listening, we invite you to pick up the ball that's been laid down in your court here. Go, where you're planted, as Adam was just saying, and create cool things. You've been listening to Creative Things, a podcast of Catholic creatives, hosted by Father Gabriel Torretta OP and Jacob Flores Popchak, produced by Jessica Flores Popchak and Kyle Meineke. To find out more about how you can support the podcast and other ventures for artists, visit catholiccreatives.org/support.